Thank you so much, Antonia. I just wanted to say hello and give a warm welcome to everyone who is joining today. Thank you for your presence, your intention, and the work that you do in our communities. Also, a heartfelt thank you to our partners at NNCTC for facilitating this panel and their dedication to trauma and healing-informed work, which is necessary to the resilience and the continued growth and wellness of our communities. So thank you all again for joining. We appreciate your interest in this resource and in bettering the lives of our communities. Thank you so much.
Hello, Yate. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this session today. I'm Veronica Willeto DeCrane, and I'm just going to start us off, hopefully in a good way, with one of my favorite poems by poet laureate Joy Harjo from the Muskogee Creek Nation. So I'm just going to share this poem with you all, and hopefully it'll put us in a good frame of mind as we get started with this conversation on cultural connectedness today. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know except in moments, steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion, like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing you are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and will die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning. Inside us, we pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. So we're just going to begin this session by doing quick introductions of all of us who are presenting today. And I'll go ahead and let my colleague Marilyn begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marilyn Zimmerman. I'm a citizen of the Nakota and Dakota nations that reside on the Fort Pecosinaboine Sioux Reservation in Montana. I'm a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe and the Shoshone Bannock people. I'm really pleased to be here with you all this afternoon and hope this can be a conversation rather than the talking heads on the screen. So welcome and looking forward to spending time with you.
And I'll go ahead and just give a little bit more information about myself. Like I said, I'm Veronica Willeto DeCrane. I'm a training and technical assistance manager with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And we have the privilege of being in partnership with the Tribal Youth Resource Center. And I'm happy to be involved in that work. Before coming to the Trauma Center, I was doing work in schools and just trying to do what I can to provide support to students who were in school. And I was able to work as a director for a consortium of after-school programs on the Crow Reservation, school-based after-school programs. And that's where I got a lot of my experience working with youth. I've also done some work with the Montana Office of Public Instruction as a consultant and coach to schools on providing tiered supports in academics as well as behavior and mental health. So that's just a little bit about my background, but I am Tenea. I grew up in New Mexico on the Navajo Reservation, and I now live in Billings with my family. I'm just happy to be joining you guys for this conversation today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nona, and I am a training and technical assistant specialist for the National Native Children's Trauma Center also. And I have been with the center for a little over 2 years. Prior to coming to the center, I worked for Planned Parenthood of Montana as a health educator. And primarily did work with Native youth in the form of health education, culturally relevant health education in my own community, which is in Fort Belknap, Montana, where I currently reside, and then also in the Crow community in one of their smaller towns there on the reservation. I'm an Ani and Nakota from Fort Belknap, Montana, where I work. I was in youth work prior to coming to this for almost 10 years. And so my background is primarily in that, trying to help youth programs find the best way to reach their youth in a trauma-informed manner. And I'm happy to be here today on this panel with you all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kimee Wind-Hummingbird, and I am a Muskogee, and I'm joining you today from my reservation in Oklahoma. A little bit about me is that I had the privilege of working for my two nations, Muskogee and Cherokee, for 22 years before joining the amazing team at NNCTC. I've been here about 6 months now. My background is primarily in Indian child welfare, but as the Director of Children and Family Services at the Muskogee Nation, I oversaw the juvenile justice program as well. My life's work has been serving families and keeping them connected to their tribe and culture. And on a personal note, I am a mother to 3 amazing young women and a kiki to 2 of the best grandchildren I could have ever dreamed of. I look forward to some great conversation this afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
So to get us started, I just wanted to go over some objectives that we're hoping to accomplish today. Pretty ambitious for us, but we'll see what we can do. But we will describe the Western and Indigenous-based evidence that cultural connectedness is a protective factor and can be used to heal our Indigenous youth and communities. We will recognize the essential role of cultural connectedness in providing and implementing trauma-informed care for Indigenous youth and their families. And we will identify best practices and promising practices for increasing feelings of connectedness in Indigenous youth, and then discuss how these practices can be implemented in a tribal youth program or a juvenile healing to wellness court. Next slide. So before we begin diving into this discussion, and we're going to start off with discussing Western and Indigenous-based evidence of cultural connectedness. So before we begin that, I just want to provide a definition to help us get on the same page about what we are talking about and about the term that we're using, cultural connectedness. So cultural connectedness is the extent to which an individual is integrated within his or her culture. So for some youth, that looks like the girl in the picture who participates in as a dancer at powwows. For other youth, cultural connectedness can look differently. It can be getting to know their relations. It can be getting to know their tribal history, or learning about their tribal's origin stories. It can be making friends and with other youth from their tribe. Because culture is so dynamic, there are so many facets to it and so many ways that our tribal youth can be connected to it. The key is that the young person feels connected, perhaps for the first time, or feels even more deeply connected over time. Next slide. So now that we have defined cultural connectedness, we want to discuss what evidence there is that it is a protective factor for our youth, and that it is a source of healing for our young ones. Next slide.
Next slide. Thank you. So we're going to just do a really quick, very shallow overview of Western evidence-based treatments and practices and Indigenous practice-based evidence, what that looks like, what that can be like as you think about the interventions that you want to implement in your communities to create cultural connectedness for your youth. So I'm thinking about some after-school programming that really connects the youth with some of their Indigenous craft ways, language programs. Then there's the juvenile healing to wellness courts that connect them with treatment models that include their traditional prayers or sacred songs. That's what what that looks like and why it's different than Western evidence-based treatment that looks to first measure your, deficits. So we have a lot in the Western way of doing treatment models or prevention practices. We have depression scales, or we have PTSD criteria that people meet, substance use disorder evaluations, and exposure to violence evaluation. So that's how we sort of look at the deficits, whereas Indigenous-based tends to look at what the strengths of an individual or a family or a community has. What are some of the supports that youth has that might not be in his household, but might be in his community or in his extended family, that sort of thing. So Indigenous practice is much more measuring in rites of passage or experiential activities. For example, participating in particular ceremonies, getting your tribal name, participating in other kinds of social gatherings like powwows or whatever. And we know that culture and ceremony is our predictive factors. But I think what I want to talk a little bit about is that really understanding that Western knowledge tends to be broken into disciplines like mathematics or physics or mental health or substance use disorder. And it emphasizes like logic, rationality, objectivity, and they want to measure everything to be measured observably, right? So the philosophical tradition rejects some metaphysical or spiritual, the spiritual realm as a source of knowledge. And really the way that we've been doing Western research has been occurring in Europe since millennium. And it really is a sort of way of viewing, it's very human-centric, as in the human beings are the most important parts of the environment. It's not the land, it's not the four-leggeds, it's not the rocks, the stars, the rivers, the lakes, it's just the human being. And for Indigenous ways of being in the world, it's very different. We have unique cultures and histories, but most of them integrate or emphasize an approach to knowledge that really is metaphysical, holistic. We tend to pass on our wisdom orally and symbolically. It's very relational and intergenerational. And our Indigenous ways of knowing really heavily rely on many forms of intelligence, including physical and spiritual intelligences. And we really do look at Mother Earth as being in relationship with her. Next slide. So Indigenous ways of knowing are interesting. Again, as I said, they're very personal. They're very experiential. We have a holistic way of being in the world. We have narratives. The oral traditions that are passed on. Those are the stories we tell of our creation, the stories we tell of our challenges, the stories we tell of overcoming hardships or overcoming challenges. And it's very much based in sort of the process, right? It's process is important, not the end of it. So the ways of being and knowing, the way of coming to know is as important as what one comes to know, right? The way we come to know is as important as what we come to know. So that is a big part of our way of being in the world, is not just getting from A to B with a straight linear way. It's the journey. It's the journey that we take that is just as important as the end result. Next slide. And when we think about that, the journey and Indigenous ways of healing, we have to think about how we think about what we call sickness or illness or hardship for ourselves. In a Western medical model, it says you have a disease, you have symptoms of a disease, and now we have to find out what the symptoms coming from, and then sometimes we just treat the symptoms like the common cold when there is no cure, but sometimes we go past the symptoms to get to the diagnosis, to get to the treatment. Indigenous ways of healing is different, right? It's looking at the whole person, not just a disease process. So if I know many of us have these stories of our relatives who suffer from substance use disorders, and when they become clean and sober and living a good balanced life, we know that something's out of balance. We know that there's been a trauma, an injury. It could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be psychological, it could be a spiritual injury. And the only remedy for that kind of injury is a spiritual and metaphysical way or holistic way of healing. So we know that we look to our ceremonies, we look to our prayers and our sacred songs, we look to the place where our people have lived for 10,000 years for the medicines that are available to us with plants or animals. And we have a process of healing, and it's okay to be in a process. So some person suffering from a substance use disorder, for example, may relapse, and that is part of the process. We know that's part of the process. So we lean into these Indigenous ways of healing that seek to uplift, support, restore, rather than diagnose and treat. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm just going to piggyback a little bit on that and talk about protective factors. Decades of research has shown that a common group of factors make young people more likely to be resilient. Protective factors don't eliminate the effects of trauma, but they can balance those effects and soften them and provide stability, even in the face of severe stress. When several protective factors are in place, young children and young adults can thrive in spite of exposure to very serious traumatic events. Even adults who may have been struggling with significant trauma for years can build resilience and change the path that they're on. It's widely known that the single most important protective factor for children who experience adversity is having at least one solid relationship, one solid trusting relationship with a supportive adult. This adult could be a parent, a grandparent, an auntie or an uncle, a neighbor, or anyone that's able to fill that role. Who the person is really doesn't matter as much as the key characteristics of the relationship. It has to be solid, stable, and unconditional. The child has to trust the person. Healing after trauma can begin to occur when we see that there are people we can trust. They make promises to us and keep them, and they say they won't expose us to danger, and they don't. When prepping for this panel, this relationship discussion made me think of Cheese and his grandma on reservation docks. To give a little context to the conversation for those of you who are not familiar with the show, when checking in at IHS, Cheese reported having no contact with either of his parents, that his grandmother was dead, and that he lived in town with his uncle. As the episode wore on, you find Cheese passing the hospital room of an elder Indian woman who mistakes him as her grandson. Initially, he tries to correct her, but when she wants to visit, because of his lack of relationships with supportive adults, he engages in the conversation, and you see a new relationship form. At the end of that episode, Cheese has wheeled her out of her hospital room, and they're enjoying some together time outside, people watching and enjoying some fresh air. Both of them needed that connection, he as a young man and she as a lonely elder. In an episode later on in the season, you see Cheese sitting at his newfound grandma's table playing chess and having lunch. His plans to leave Oklahoma with his friends have taken shape, and he needs to let her know. So he hesitantly begins the conversation with, I need to tell you something. I'm not your grandson. To which she simply replies, sure you are, even if you aren't. That moment is so real in Indian communities. That connection to a trusted and supportive adult is essential in healing from trauma. I know firsthand the significance of many grandmas in my life, even if they weren't my grandma. Next slide, please. Another protective factor is having cultural and spiritual connections. There's an interconnectedness that we all share in tribal communities, that feeling of responsibility for others, for culture, and for the preservation of our traditions. The care that we show to our children from young age is so important. The community they are surrounded with is vital to their growth and development. Our communities today continue to thrive because our people value each other, and we recognize that our continuation as peoples is dependent on each of us. The little one in the middle, in the purple with pigtails, she's a mom now. And her big sister behind her, she's the best auntie you'll find anywhere. These girls, my children, know the love of community by their connectedness to it. They feel safe here. They feel loved. It's bigger than them. Sometimes we struggle to put those words into those feelings into words to those outside of our communities. The bond that we have to our people, to our traditions, it's real and it's a protective factor. Definitely. Nona, would you like to share your thoughts?
Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you, Kimee. So my slides are going to be kind of more of a very specific programmatic approach to how cultural connectedness can be infused into any kind of program, youth program that you might be working with in your community. It could be something you do at an after-school program. It could be something that you use in a boys and girls club, or it could be something, you know, if you have any kind of youth program structure in your community, this could be some ideas or suggestions or ways that you could potentially utilize cultural connectedness to infuse into maybe something that is coming from a Western-based perspective, and finding ways within your own culture and your own approaches to include your own teachings into your program structure. And my approaches were through a health education. And so when I first started with this, it was a topic, area of health that is still considered taboo in many of our communities, but that is something that has been influenced by colonization. And it was sexuality education. And so over time, because of the impact from boarding schools that many of our communities have felt, in mission schools, you know, those teachings about our bodies, those teachings about relationships, those teachings about courting and all of that were pretty much wiped away or stamped out or suppressed because they were viewed as dirty, or they were made to feel shame about their bodies. And so reframing health through an Indigenous lens. So each of our communities, each of our tribes all had their own teachings around health. And that was probably all areas of health, but more specifically around what we taught our girls, what we taught our boys, about what was expected of them as young girls, as young boys growing into young men and women. And so when starting this, these programs that I was creating in the communities that I worked in, which was my own, and then also in a tribal community that wasn't my own within the pro community, that was finding who were the stakeholders, you know, figuring out who to talk to, what are the teachings of that community, and then finding ways to incorporate that into the curriculums that we were using. So thinking about, you know, what did we teach our children about health prior to colonization? And then how do we combine the Western approaches with our own teachings? What parts of health have been impacted by a colonial lens, which is probably all of them. Finding ways to create safe spaces. So, you know, when we think back to, in some of our communities, the young girls would go with their grandmas, or they would go with their aunties. And the young boys would go with their uncles, or they would go with their older brothers, or maybe their older cousins. And so that was how we learned our roles in our what was expected of us as we were growing into young men and women. And so thinking about, at least from a health education standpoint, you know, how did we teach our young? And then just finding ways to incorporate that into any kind of programming that you're doing, because the chances are the kinds of youth programming that you might be doing are utilizing some kind of structure to teach your youth something. So how do you incorporate your own tribal teachings? And if those aren't accessible, finding out who that person, maybe it's one person, or maybe it's multiple people of who has that knowledge still. And if that knowledge is accessible, finding out who those people are to access. Oh, and then really quick. So that logo, Healthy Native Youth, that is a curriculum that is available, and it's a website. If you know how to do the QPR codes or the QR codes there on the slide, if you put your phone up to it, it'll take you to that website. And that is a health education curriculum that's been culturally adapted for Native American youth.
Next slide. So as we've talked about so far, you know, there's all kinds of different evidence that we can draw upon, that we can look into, that we can find out about to really help us in supporting us as we try to develop cultural connectedness programming. And oftentimes we need data, we need evidence to help our programs secure funding and other resources that we need in order to carry out this type of programming. And there is a growing body of research on cultural connectedness. Researchers are finding that there are positive mental health outcomes for Indigenous youth linked to their feelings of being culturally connected. And researchers are also finding that promoting protective factors like our cultures is more effective in preventing suicide than reducing risk for Native youth. So as Marilyn explained, you know, the differences between the way that Indigenous peoples have traditionally addressed different issues within our people. It's really been more of a strength-based approach where we've focused on what are the strengths, what are the ways that we can strengthen this young person, strengthen the community, strengthen the family. And those are those protective factors that buffer against stress and buffer against trauma and buffer against some of the adversity that our people go through. So focusing on that can get us more results and outcomes than trying to eliminate all of the risk factors that may be in existence for a young person. So that's one of the things that we're learning from research. Can you go to the next slide, please? With that said, I just want to reiterate what my colleagues have been pointing out in what they've shared so far. Dr. Vine Delorio Jr. said, we need to get back to thinking with our hearts, meaning reclaiming our tribal ways. Yes, it may be that they were taken from us and that they were suppressed, and that we may not at this moment know what they are or be connected to those ways. But as we are trying to connect our young people to those ways, we too can also strengthen our connections to those ways. So while Western science values people who have degrees, tribes and tribal communities value and recognize a specific set of behaviors and wisdom in individuals that are given the honor of serving as elders in our communities and in our tribes. So while knowledge in Western science is passed down through published written studies, teachings passed down by elders have been the basis of healthy tribal communities for centuries. So oral history and storytelling are the equivalent to the research papers that we often cite. So I just want to pose to you some questions. How are you integrating elders and their wisdom and knowledge into your programs? As much as you look at the research and what it tells us is effective, is there also that space for the elders and what they know to be true and are wanting to pass down to us? And how are you using oral history and stories as data and evidence to inform your work? You know, as much as the studies that we cite, the evidence-based practices that we are often encouraged to utilize, do we also look at our oral histories and stories as evidence as well? So next slide, please. So just to take a pause, we just want to invite, are there any questions that folks have or comments that individuals have about Western or Indigenous-based evidence for cultural connectedness? We're happy to take a pause right now and answer any of those questions. As it was mentioned, you can put it in the question and answer, click on the Q&A button and put it there, or you can put it into chat.
Or comments, like I see Mary Williams in chat said she's hoping to be an ally for elders to intentionally bring their stories to the table over and over again.
That is awesome, Mary. Were there any other comments that the panelists wanted to make about what was shared or what was brought up?
Or if there is any specific questions around what anyone has shared so far.
Are there elder programs that encourage mentoring of youth?
I know this is like more of a, it's more of a resource and not really a culturally based program, although I feel like you could make it culturally based, but one of the resources is Senior Corps. Have you guys ever heard of that? It's like a branch of AmeriCorps, and it's where you can pay elders a stipend, especially if they're retired, maybe they're on a fixed income, and you can utilize them. I've seen some schools utilize them for in different ways, just to be in the classroom with the students. But they could be in your program, they could be a part of your juvenile healing to wellness court. And I'm sure elders have their own views of what they would be okay with. So this might not be culturally something they're okay with, especially if they're sharing cultural based knowledge, but to be paid for in that way. But it is a resource if you're hoping to compensate or if you're hoping to have a structured way of bringing in elders. We have some more comments coming in.
I was just going to add really quickly to that too. I know that some of the discussion that I've had previous about some of our children who were in need of community service hours, we talked about connecting them with some of the elders just to help, you know, build that connection and maybe share stories. But in addition to that, help the elders with anything they may need around their home too. You know, if they needed to clean up or mow the lawn or something. So it's important to definitely tap into that resource if it's available.
Suzanne asked the question about the body of research that supports strong cultural connectedness as a protective factor. Yeah, there is. What we can do is send some of the articles to to Laura and Antonia, and they can send them out to the listserv. At
We
least
actu-
it'll start.
Yeah, we will also be sharing them in next month's newsletter for TYRC. We're going to be sharing about cultural connectedness. So we'll also have those, some of those studies that have been done listed, referenced in that TYRC newsletter as well.
And
Lisa,
then I don't know if you
Breeden
guys saw Sarah. I don't know if you guys saw Sarah's question. Also, it was right before Suzanne's. How do we know if a child is being supported enough to increase protective factors and cultural connectiveness, especially if they're not living near other Indigenous people and being raised in a white home?
You don't
Yeah.
ask easy questions, do you?
How do we know if a child is being supported enough? Right. So we're going to talk about some tools that measure cultural connectedness. Maybe that is a way to, and then we'll talk about some ways, example of fostering cultural connectedness, even for those youth who may not be in their home tribal communities or may not be near relatives or have trouble accessing in that way. So it's to come, maybe.
Yeah, the newsletter is part of this conversation, and getting back to you with some actual articles where you can find them hopefully on Google Scholar to be able to help you.
Now, Mary mentioned who would administer Senior Corps, AmeriCorps. Senior Corps, I'm not very familiar with how it's administered. I know AmeriCorps, I used to be in AmeriCorps Vista, so I know that the way that it was administered is a tribe can pay for a portion of their stipend, but then the rest of it is covered by AmeriCorps, and they would be supervised by someone from the tribe, but they would directly supervise, but they also have a counterpart in the AmeriCorps organization that supervises them as well. Yeah, value their time, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the struggle, right, with grants and things like that, is to be able to pay for volunteers, community volunteers, and for their expertise that are culturally based. Definitely, if we can, provide a stipend or provide some type of compensation, that definitely shows that we value their contributions.
Leslie Jimenez. So the one program that I think about, there have been definitely where they have traditional gardens that are attached to juvenile detention centers. I do know that there is a tribe who has a Head Start program, and they're starting to plant their traditional foods in a space that they have. So people are definitely beginning to think about what that means, what the place of where their people live mean, and what sort of the responsibility do we have as the people in that place to support the environment and to relearn some of the ways that we interact and had relationship with that environment.
So I hate to be the one, but I'm gonna have to move us along so we have time for the remainder of what we're going to cover, but we're going to have 2 more opportunities for questions as well. So we'll hopefully be able to get to more questions that folks have. So next slide.
So we're going to take a look at connectedness and trauma-informed care in communities. And it's one of the things, of course, that since we're the National Native Children's Trauma Center, that we've been working towards developing for the last 15 years. And really started out thinking deficits treatment and now move much more towards family and community-based interventions that support individuals and family members and communities. So next slide, please. So really the work that we do, and when we do train direct service providers, or we train certain disciplines or certain systems, whether it's primary care or juvenile justice, we talk about in historical and intergenerational trauma, not necessarily as sort of a historical, this is history and we need to know it, but we have to be aware of the impacts of the collective traumas that happen to our people. We always like to say there's over 500 and maybe 74, 75, who knows, today it's probably different, federally recognized tribes. There's over 300 state recognized tribes. And we all have unique languages, cultures, and ways of being in the world. But what we have in common is the experience, the detrimental experience of colonization. So we really do have to be cognizant of some of the impacts of colonization, on the impacts of removal from our homelands, the impacts of boarding school on our parenting, cultural parenting, and nurturing ways of being in the world. Some of the ways that our land has been stripped of its resources and impacted us physically with our health, and the impacts it has had on the generations. So that we have to be cognizant of it. It's not that we have to belabor it, because I do know there are some folks that, oh, are we still talking about historical trauma? Yes, we are. And we are going to continue to talk about historical trauma until we as a people of these tribal nations have created a response to historical and intergenerational trauma that isn't just individual, but family and community and collectively impactful. So next slide.
Okay, so when we think about supporting families, we must remember that a young child's relationship with their caregiver is vital to development. And parent trauma can impact how well or if that attachment is made. A parent needs to have support to overcome past adversity, including their own trauma history, so that they can develop a safe and healthy home for their child. If you don't understand and address parent trauma, then you can't truly create well-being for the family as a whole. Just as with building resilience in individuals, building family resilience is also a process. We know that trauma-informed care is not a curriculum that you can follow from A to Z. It's about a mindset, how you, as a service provider, can shift your thinking, apply a trauma lens, and understand how parents' past and current trauma is impacting their current actions. Focused on what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. Next slide. These are some questions to ask yourself when working alongside families. What can you put in place to support the family? What culturally appropriate services are available to the family? Always keep in mind, communication is key. In order to have that open line of communication, you should be approachable and encouraging to the family. I found in my work with families, when they saw someone who believed in them, who was on their team and working with them, that changed their whole outlook and mindset. Nona, you have some insight to offer as well.
Thank you, Kimee. So kind of piggybacking on what Kimee said about, how might their parents or families be impacted by trauma, and how that can carry into into their actions and how they perceive things. And this is something that could be not necessarily a barrier, but it could make it a little bit harder to implement something new, especially if it's something that is, that has turned into a taboo topic, such as certain areas of health education. And that's where taking into consideration the impact of colonization on how we view health currently. and while there are some movements into incorporating more Indigenous ways of thinking in regard to certain areas of health education. And I'm talking more specifically about sexuality health education, because that's what I was doing programming with. And that, you know, as you probably can imagine, that can be pretty taboo. People are still very sensitive to talking about that. They're sensitive to their youth being taught sexuality education. But when we're talking in terms of prevention, it can be something that can really benefit a youth, because it's more than just than what people think it is. It covers the whole person, the whole body, the whole. It's like a holistic approach to a youth, in the way that they think, in the way that they act, in the way that they interact with each other. And they don't often get opportunities to talk about it with anybody, because of the impact that colonization has had on these kind of conversations and teachings that we used to have with our youth. And so if that is something that is making it a little bit harder, then finding, you know, could be an opportunity for the health educator, if they're not from the tribe they're serving, to learn more about this tribe that they're serving. And whether that is, you know, if you have access to an elder or someone who is willing to share that information, or if that information has been suppressed for so long that maybe they don't have that original education or that original teaching. Sometimes it can be found in literature. That's where I learned about some of the tribes that I served. Find out who would be the ones to meet with, talk with, and learn from in regard to how they would prefer their youth be taught, and take that, you know, into consideration, but also take into consideration what the youth may be needing and what they may be wanting. And then what parts of the culture can we include, and is it accessible for us if we're not from that community? How can we include it? Maybe if we're not super educated about it or informed about it, how can we still include it? Can we invite people in to teach this certain part of this program, this part of the lesson? Are there gender roles that should be honored? So if you're a female health educator, is it acceptable for you to teach male students? Or if you're a male educator, health educator, is it acceptable for you to be to teach female students? And so taking that into consideration as well. And if that is not something that can be done, how can you make sure that you're catching all of the youth that you'll be serving, so that one or the other isn't left out? And maybe even asking if they have a different view of gender within their communities, because that is something also that is not always binary. Some tribes had a gender spectrum. Are there do's and don'ts? Are there things that you can talk about, or are there things you shouldn't talk about at all? For instance, like some tribal stories can only be told during a certain time of year. If they're in a hemisphere where there's snow, sometimes those stories can't be told until the snow falls. And are there certain protocols that need to be included in figuring out youth programming altogether? So is this something that can even be done there? And sometimes it can't be, and that's honoring tribal teachings, that's honoring tribes' sovereignty, that's honoring the tribe itself, and that itself is trauma informed. So next slide, please. And I think Veronica is taking over on this one.
So just to reiterate what others have said, that Indigenous healing of trauma focuses on the current traumatic event, but it's also about healing from cumulative and historical trauma that is experienced by a young person. So, anytime that we are integrating cultural connectedness into what we do, we are providing trauma-informed care in a way that is responsive to the young person and what they're currently going through, maybe the current traumatic event that they're experiencing. But it's also healing and helpful to these young people to heal from historical, intergenerational, and cumulative traumas that they've experienced and that they continue to be impacted by, such as racism and forced assimilation and grief and loss. Next slide. So those cumulative and historical traumas that I mentioned. They include the forced assimilation that was experienced by our youth's grandparents and great grandparents. Through forced assimilation, the children and youth who attended boarding schools lost their culture and languages, or as somebody in the chat mentioned, it was not lost, but taken away from them. And they were taught that their culture and languages were less than and of no value. So this was the worst type of identity development, to be taught to hate yourself. So healthy identity development of the youth in our programs is an important part of providing trauma-informed care. Healthy identity development is key to social and emotional learning. It is key to feeling that sense of safety in yourself, with yourself. Our young people today need cultural connectedness as part of healthy identity development, as part of the healing that needs to happen from the cumulative and historical trauma of boarding schools and other forced assimilation that is still being passed down to our youth today. Next slide, please. So one of SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration's principles of trauma-informed care. They have a resource that talks about the different principles of trauma-informed care and about how systems can be more trauma-informed. But one of the principles that they point out is empowerment, otherwise referred to as voice and choice. So young people that experience trauma often have had no sense of control over what happened to them, or feel no sense of control over themselves or their lives. And through validating and recognizing their trauma experience, the contemporary ones, as well as the historical and cumulative ones, it allows them to foster a sense of self-efficacy, self-determination, and dignity. So our young people want to learn about their cultures. As Nona mentioned, they want to be connected to their cultures. There are so many new cultural skills that they can learn that will help them in life, in this contemporary life, not just with their mental health, but it will help them with all areas of their life, including their academics. Next slide, please. Yeah. Thanks, Nona, for sharing about the picture. So this is another opportunity if folks want to ask questions, if they want to make any comments about the essential role of cultural connectedness in trauma-informed care. Maybe you have some experiences of what you've seen that has been effective, or what you've seen as for providing trauma-informed care that connecting our young people to their cultures has afforded them. Okay. Does anybody else have any comments on the panel that they want to make before we move on? Nona, did you want to share what you were sharing in the chat?
Oh, yeah. So I don't know if you saw is just a caption for the picture that was in the one slide that Veronica had shared. It was of the young Tenea man who I don't think that it says how old he was when he arrived, but it was that picture on the left was when he first arrived at Carlisle, and then the picture on the right was after he had been at Carlisle for a few years. And so they would do before and after pictures of the students who arrived to these, I don't like calling them schools because they weren't schools, but to these places where they took our children. And they would use that as sort of propaganda to show that our youth could be civilized or could be assimilated. And if you even notice, the color of his skin was even lighter as compared to when he arrived. And that was intentional. They would intentionally make the camera light to make the students look lighter than what they actually were. So just a little background. And if you Google his name, Tom Trelino, he'll pop up, and you can actually access some of those archives that are available for free to learn more about those student files. All of the students and their student files are available in the archives.
Thank you, Nona. The next slide, please.
So we're going to take a look at best and promising practices and obviously we do not have even a literature review. There's so many tribes that are really embedding their culture and their ceremonies and into the work that they do to support their children, youth, and their families. Next slide. I just want to tell a story that I've been given permission to tell that sort of brings home this idea of how cultural connectedness is not just healing, it's prevention. So we worked with a tribe to develop a suicide prevention protocol for the tribe that had experienced a suicide cluster of their young people. And part of the response has always been, and I know we hear it from our elders and our tribal leaders, where they say, when they see a university person like who we are coming into their communities, saying, how come you're always measuring our deficits? How come you're always telling us what's wrong with us? How come you never tell us what's right? How come you never look at our strengths? And so, and how come you won't fund what we know to be true, that there is healing in our ceremonies, there is healing in our culture that has been there for 10,000 years, but we can't get funded to do it. Well, that landscape is changing with federal and state funding across the nation. It's not perfect by any means, but it is changing for the positive. So we worked with this tribe, we wrote a grant with the tribe, and so we were funded to do suicide prevention and early intervention. And one of the things that the tribe wanted to do is they wanted to offer sweat lodge ceremonies to their young men, 2 young men. In my world, they were young, they were in their 40s and 50s. So 2 young men who had been given the rights of performing the sweat lodge ceremony for this particular tribe. And so they began to invite through relationships, because it's never it's not a random assignment. We develop relationships with our folks. They develop a relationship with the Juvenile Detention Center. So sometimes some of those youth would come out and start out coming out to the sweat from that JDC, but later, once released, many continue to come. But this particular story is one that really brings home the impact of ceremony and thinking about traditional ways of knowledge systems. It's really, if you compare, it's trust-based inherited wisdom compared to this skepticism of Western European experimentation. It's respect for all things, and it's locally verified. So this is the story. I don't know how we put it in a Excel sheet, right? It's very different about how we can do this. So anyway, there was a young man who was coming out to this particular sweat lodge, and he was doing really well, and he was participating fully. And but then he suddenly sort of dropped off their radar. They hadn't seen him in a few weeks, and that's fine. No, there was none of this, you have to come. There was no, you come because you want to, you come because you're invited, and you come out of relationship, and you come because you want to be here. So this young man came back after probably about 6 weeks, and in the lodge where he had been taught some of his sacred songs, where he had been taught his creation story of his people, where he'd been taught the ways to pray to the grandfathers, he'd absorbed it all, right? And he came back and he said that he just, kind of got tired of coming. It's a lot of work, right? Sweat Lodge is hard. It's not an easy ceremony to participate in. But he got to the place a few weeks later where he felt like no one cared about him. And he felt like his teachers didn't care about him. He felt like his friends didn't care about him. His parents didn't care about him. They weren't raising him. He was living with an uncle. His siblings didn't care, the uncle and extended family. He felt very isolated and alone in that moment. And he thought about taking his own life. And he said, and as I laid on my bed thinking about how I was going to do this, all of a sudden I thought, nobody cares, but the grandfathers care. They care about whether I live. They care about whether or not I keep the ceremonies going, whether I sing the sacred songs, whether I, keep saying the prayers that have been prayed for 10,000 years. They care. And so that's why I'm back. So you can see in a Western worldview, that looks like suicide prevention. But for us, it was about relationship, not just with another human being, not with a human mentor, but a relationship with the spiritual, a relationship with creation, a relationship with who his grandfathers were and what they meant to him and how that impacted his identity and developed in him a sense of worth, of value, and that somebody cared. And if nobody on the planet cared, the grandfathers cared. So that's what I mean by leaning into promising practices. That's a promising practice. I don't know, there's protocols and ways that we'll have to talk about how we do this, right? How we measure this. I'm not going to stand by a sweat lodge with a clipboard. And I hope no one else does. But it's the communities are really starting to do that. Think about how this is. We know it exists. How do we access it? How do we access culture and ceremonies and language for our children and our youth and our families to heal? So thank you for letting me share this story. Next slide, Veronica. Kimee, sorry, Kimee.
That's okay. Thank you. Yeah, we know what works best in our communities, right? We live here. We know what works and what doesn't. And it's like I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's hard to put into words because we just live it every day. And we know how to help heal, how to help each other heal. But some things that I thought were important to add and some tips I think were important were to walk alongside families are providing them with a safe space to work in and recognizing that safety is defined by those you serve, not by the provider standards. Take your cues from the family and ensure that your approach is genuine and sincere. Uplift their individual strengths and build on their experiences. Family knows what works for them. Service providers can support that by listening to their voice and following their lead. Make every effort to operate with transparency and maintain trust with everyone involved. Give them that sense of hope. That's what's so important. In all of my experience in working with the families that I've worked with for 22 years, I found that if those families saw that little glimmer of hope, if you sat next to them and said, I'm here to help you, we can get through this together. How do we get you where you need to be? That's sometimes all they needed, just that little bit of hope. Nona?
Thank you, Kimee. Next slide, please. So these are just some best practices, approaches, questions that you could use to implement any kind of youth program. Mine was health education, figuring out who the stakeholders are. So if that's your elders, or if that's your youth, or if it's everybody, how can you include all parts of the community into what you're trying to do so that it can be successful? Is there a youth advisory council already established? And if there is, how can you include the youth voice into what kind of programming you're going to be offering? Because if this is a youth program that you are implementing, you want their voices to be included in that, because it will be something that they'll be utilizing. And who are the gatekeepers of the community? Is that the elders again, or is that the parents, or is that someone else? Is it the council? Is there a health advisory council that exists? You know, figuring out who those gatekeepers are, building those relationships with those gatekeepers. And that ultimately will be the deciding factor of whether or not you'll even be able to do anything because they are the ones that I guess are kind of the protectors of the community. And we understand why that is, which is also another impact of colonization. Building trust with the community. So if you say that you're going to be, you know, be there. If you schedule meetings, if you schedule anytime that you're meeting with an elder, usually bring a gift or gatekeepers, whoever those gatekeepers are. And that could even be presented to the council or whoever their governing body is, or if they have an elders council, bringing gifts for that council. And building trust with youth. If that is something, if you get that far and you're starting to implement your program with the youth, making sure that you're consistent, because that inconsistency is going to harm your relationship with building that trust with youth. And that's going to impact the success of your program. And then how can we help tribal communities make it sustainable? So if you are on a grant, a fund that only lasts maybe 5 years, which is what some grant cycles are, and sometimes they're only a year, how can we help that community internalize that program to make it sustainable? So is it going to be something that belongs with the tribal health department? Is it going to be something that belongs with the Boys and Girls Club? Is it going to be something that can be internalized by the council itself? So figuring out who and what that department or who those people are that are going to keep this program going once that funding ends, and how can we make it sustainable so that, especially if it's successful and it works, how can we keep it going after we're done or after the grant funding is done? Next slide.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, I was a director of a consortium of after-school programs on a Crow reservation. And before I came to this leadership role, I was just a frontline staff in one of those communities. And I was the coordinator of the school-based after-school program in Pryor, Montana. And I'm not Crow. I didn't grow up there, and I'm from New Mexico. And so I was the person that was coming in from the outside, that was in this role of trying to provide programming for our young people. I knew culture was an important part of the learning that the youth needed. So I tried to integrate that into our grant goals and objectives. So like, for example, for our health and fitness goals, we offered, double ball and arrow throwing. For art and music, we offered regalia making and a drum group and cooking class that at times incorporated traditional foodways, learning about traditional foodways. For language arts, we offered a film club. So when I first started these offerings, I was trying to get my students to participate in cultural events and cultural practices. So we had the beading, we had the, all of these different things. And I encourage them to participate, for example, if they're going to be making regalia, they can participate in some of the events that are happening in the community and use that regalia, because some of our young people didn't have that. And so they really couldn't participate in those community events because they didn't have their regalia. So we tried to support them in that way. We also tried to support different things that were already happening in the community. Like, Clan Day was a big event that would happen every year. That's where they kind of teach the students about their clans and about who their clan relations are, and the students make a gift and they give it to their clan aunt or uncle, and that clan aunt or uncle prays for them. And so we would help the students make their gifts. So we really try to incorporate culture in different ways like that. But one of the ways that we tried to do it too was through a film club. And we teamed up with the Crow Crow Tobacco Prevention Program. And they were looking for a PSA to create a PSA. So we teamed up with them and to have our students make that PSA for them. And we partnered with the Montana State University Film School. And so together we taught the students how to make a film. And through that process, a lot of the students were part of the film club because they wanted to make their own movies. They wanted to learn to edit, and they wanted to just kind of learn some of those skills. But through the process of making this film, they actually got to learn more about their own tribe and culture. Because at the beginning, we would ask them questions of, what do you know about the significance of tobacco to your people? And some would know a little bit, but through the process, they got to interview elders, they got to interview, a tobacco society member, and so that they could make their film, and they were able to learn more about their people. They learned about their origin story and how they became, people of the tobacco. So that's kind of what we did to try and integrate and infuse culture, even though we had grant objectives. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up too is these are the students that participated in that project that's in the picture. And they weren't the students that usually attended cultural events or participated in cultural practices. And so this was just a way for them to be connected to their culture without in a different way than maybe what we might traditionally think of, like, connecting our young people to their culture. So next slide, please. And just to follow up with that, so cultural connectedness doesn't just have to be fostered through cultural events and practices. I know somebody mentioned, like, what do we do with those youth that are kind of disconnected from their communities, or maybe they've been adopted out and they don't really know much about their people. And so what are some things that we can do for them? And so one of the studies that has been published has talked about how peer youth mentoring programs are really helpful for helping young people increase their feelings of cultural connectedness. So these are done either in a school setting or community organization setting. So they can be done in your tribal program setting. Especially like if you're trying to reach like urban, maybe some of the urban youth, trying to outreach to some of the urban youth. But it's, for those young people that maybe don't have a great deal of interest in participating in some of the cultural events or practices, or maybe they just aren't really, don't have access to it as much as others do. So this is just one way that we can do that. It's just one example. Next slide, please. And just to follow up on what Marilyn talked about, of course, we're not going to stand outside a sweat lodge with a clipboard. But, how can we measure? Because I think that's the struggle, right? When we're trying to get funding and we're trying to make our program sustainable and continue to exist in our communities, we have to show evidence that it's working and it's effective in order to continue with funding, and also just to be held accountable to our stakeholders, those in our communities, the parents and, the community members, and to let them know that what we are doing in a authentic and respectful way. And so these are just a couple of tools that can help. You can adapt them to your tribal setting. Maybe some of you are using them. Maybe you guys could share what it's been like for you to use these tools, but One comes out of First Nations in Canada and the other from Alaska natives. And so they're just tools to help where students take these scales and these surveys, and they are trying to measure how connected they feel to their culture before and after programming that they participate in. So one of the scales, this cultural connectedness scale from First Nations, they've actually talked about, they've done research with it and have actually published their findings of how this scale has shown effectiveness for increasing feelings of connectedness, has shown that the cultural programming that these First Nations people were doing did prove to be effective in doing that. So that's just one of the examples, but I'd love to hear from you guys if you guys have used these tools before, or maybe other ways that you measure what you're doing. I know it's kind of hard to find evidence-based ways, because as we've been talking about, evidence looks different for us as Indigenous people. And so I'd be curious to hear if you guys have tried to measure what you're doing, and if you are seeing good results from it. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is our last opportunity for Q&A. So if you have any thoughts or comments about tools that you're using to measure, or just any kinds of promising practices that maybe your program is participating in that you want to share, or if you have any questions for us. Is there anybody that,
look.
oh,
Oh, somebody's saying goodbye.
oh, okay.
Bye, Suzanne.
So Trisha, I think that's how you pronounce your name, says they're trying to develop tools to measure the impact when we do cultural activities. That's awesome. Yeah, you'll have to let us know, like if you do use one of the tools, how it's working for you. If there's other ways that you're measuring your success.
The Blackfeet Nation has a juvenile healing to wellness court grant, and they have developed a cultural identity scale. So if you're interested, I could get you in contact with the director of that programming. And I think they use it a lot. For example, like maybe one of the questions is, do you have your Blackfeet name? And if the youth answers no, well, then part of the strategy is to figure out a way to get those youth that say no, that are involved in their courts, to receive their Blackfeet name. So they've got access to cultural and spiritual teachers in the community. And, then they can check that box, so to speak. And so it is a measurement that just measures access to those sorts of cultural things that develop our cultural identity. So I don't sure how you, Tricia, I don't know how you reach out to us. That would be a question for Antonio or Laura, or they can reach out to you from us as we, and have Chenille reach out to you directly, the director from Blackfeet.
I also know of Northern Cheyenne has a suicide prevention program that has a similar scale that they're using for suicide prevention. And they've been developing lessons and that they teach at the local schools on Cheyenne culture, and they're using that measurement to help measure just knowledge, but also feeling connected to their culture and to their people, and also their thoughts about suicide. So I'm happy to connect you with that contact if you're interested. All right, yeah, Laura said go ahead and email tribalyouth@tlpi.org. She put that in the chat, and you can connect with, ask for, support after this session, and we'll be happy to follow up with you and connect you to those resources. All right, well, next slide. I think we are closing. So I want us to walk away in a good way and with good feelings. So send you all off for the rest of your day. And so I just want to end with another poem that I will be citing. And I just want to thank all of you guys for joining us today, and thank all the panelists for what they've shared, and for TYRC for this opportunity to connect with all of you. So I'll go ahead and close with this poem by Tenea Winder, who is another Native poet. It's called Being. Wake up, greet the sun and pray. Burn cedar, sweet grass, sage, sacred herbs to honor the lives we've been given. For we have been gifted these ways since the beginning of time. Remember, when you step into the arena of your life, think about those who stand beside you, next to, and with you. Your ancestors are always in your corner, along with your people. When we enter this world, we are born hungry. Our spirits long for us to live out our traditions that have been passed down for generations. Prayer, ceremony, dance, language are ways of being. Never forget you are put on this earth for a reason. Honor your ancestors. Be a good relative. Next slide, please. So that concludes our session for today. Just thank you guys so much for joining us and for being a great, active, engaged group. We enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time. And we'll stay on after a little bit if anybody has a question or comment.
It looks like there's one in the Q&A box from LaDonna. She's interested in the Blackfeet scale that they use. So someone make sure they.
I think that Laura put the contact information for TLPI or TYRC so that you can reach out to her, and whoever wants the Blackfeet scale, we can get you in contact with Chanel Running Crane at Blackfeet.
And Nikki asked if we will be sending out the PowerPoint and the recording, and we will. It'll be in a follow-up email that will be sent out to all of you guys.
There is a survey link also that Laura has shared with you all. So if you would take some time to go ahead and click on the survey link and complete that survey.
So there's a question in the Q&A from Nikki Lee. There's excellent presentation. Thank you for the efforts. I learned a lot. Will you be sending out PowerPoint to participants and a recording link?
Yes. It'll be sent out in a follow-up email from TYRC. So you guys will get an email.
And the survey was in the chat, but I think it's quite a ways up before people started commenting.
It's right above you, Mary.
No, she's asking about the survey, I think.
Oh, the survey, sorry.
Mhm. There it is again. Laura just shared it again.
Okay, there it is. Takes a village. TLPI folks, do you have any last comments or things that you have to do to wrap up this presentation, this panel?
Looks like one more question just came in from Sarah. Where can we get the cultural connectedness scale?
We can share it with Laura. We can share it with you when it goes out in the email. The 2 scales.
So that you can send it on to whoever attended.
Yeah, and along with the PowerPoint and
Yep, that sounds good. And we'll share the survey link there too. I think nothing else from TLPI, but just thank you everyone so much for joining, and thank you to everyone at NNCTC for all of your energy and effort that's gone into this. It's been a really wonderful panel.
Thank you, Laura.
Yes, thank you.